With QVScriptor open, let's start with some of the functions under the file option here before we get into the actual development. So when opening up or clicking on the file section, straight away you're brought to support, where you can get all our manuals that are available with your installation. You can open up the log file for further troubleshooting. You can send an email to support if you're struggling with something, or you can get support with regards to the help. What we have is, from this instance, since we're running a local QSproj file in Scriptor, we can then save the workspace as, and save it as a completely new name, and then open it further to continue, sort of making a file backup. The info section, providing you with what version of Scriptor you're running, and what's your Scriptor mode that you're running in, as we can run in 86 or the 64, and then what your operating system is as well. Under the Manage Licenses, here you'll see what license you're currently running, when does it expire, who's it licensed to, and what's the ID, which you can then further refresh the license. You can deactivate it in order to move your installation to a new machine, and then the different activation options, so being manually or online. Also, what we have is the options section. In here you can define what version of ClickView you want to run on, as we do support version 9, 10 and 11. And to test that it works, you can click Launch. You can set what's your default projects directory. So in this case it's always in the app data local of your user. And what's your local target for demo purposes or local development. This can all be changed as well. From the schema settings, what's the font that you want to use and the font size. The project options, so generate all scripts in one tab. In other words, when you decide to export your script to ClickView, it will just create one tab called QVS, and that's where your script will be. But by default, we don't have this ticked, as in order to sort of add this flow into ClickView and break up each of our schema objects within the ClickView application. Just putting table identifiers, so we've gone with the double quotes around the field and table identifiers, and then the prefix tables with catalogs and prefix table with schemas. External applications, so if you have an external file viewer that you would like to use, for example Notepad++, and then for comparing purposes, using a software like WinMerge, you can define what the application is and what's the parameters as well when actually looking at the differences between the two applications. And then we have lastly the administration. So in the administration component, this is where a QVScriptor administrator can administer users, so add and create users as well as groups, define deployment targets, define the deployment folders, and also modify any common folders that are currently set in there. So to create a new user, we just say add user. We define what the username is, so I'm going to put my name here, what the description is, what is the login method used, so in this case I'm going to use just with a password, and define a password. And just state that the user is active. Also we can define what the user belongs to, so in terms of group membership. So in this case I'm just going to add the user to administrators. There we go, so now the user has admin privileges. And then in our later releases we'll also be able to define the security around those users or the groups thereof. So I can say OK, and there I can now see my new user. If you have a user in the system that you'd like to delete, just highlight the user and say delete and confirm it, and that will then delete the user from the actual system there. Deployment targets. So this is where you set up where your QVW applications or QVD generators or QVDs are saved to. So in a typical situation or environment, you would have a QA environment and a production environment. There is no need to set up a dev environment, as dev actually happens locally on your current machine. So with the deployment targets, so I'm going to go and create a new deployment target, click the plus sign, give the target a name, QA. As I'm going to set up a local target that's installed on my machine, I don't need to define a username and password. But on a server setup, this is where you just define the server's administrator username and password in order for all the connected clients to be able to utilize those folders. With the target URL, the best is to use a share setup. So I'm going to paste my share that I've created, and once you've put in all that information, we can say test target, and we'll get a test successful. You can click OK. Then I'm going to go ahead and create my other target name. This is production, and paste my target URL in again. Just change that to prod, test it, and everything's successful. Okay, there I have my deployment targets now set up. Next I can move on to my deployment folders. So deployment folders are folder names that can be added to projects themselves. So as you'll see, when we create a new project in QVScriptor, you can define what deployment folder name it should use. So typically your deployment folders are like your departments within an organization, or namings of apps that you want to group together. So if you want to create a development folder where all your development testing apps go into, or an HR or a finance folder, so for any HR or finance apps, they all fall under the same grouping. So when you create a deployment folder, this also defines the file structure within your deployment targets. So if you create an app within the HR project that's assigned to the deployment folder HR, it will then go and create a HR folder in the deployment targets for you. So I'm going to create a deployment folder, and this folder name, I'm going to call it HR, and then I'm going to add another deployment folder called finance. Then we move on to the common folders. So this is the folder structure that QVScriptor will save in any of your deployment targets. And this can be modified a little bit, and we are going to add in later on to be able to add your own deployment folders. But for the meantime, what you'll see is the structure will always be deployment target, so what you define, be it QA or production, / access point for all your ClickView applications, and then if you define a deployment folder, what folder they must be saved into. So in this case, either HR or finance. Same with the data models and QVD generators. But what you could do, for example, with all your QVD files created, and you don't want them to be saved in specific deployment folders, the $deployment folder from here can be removed, and now all QVDs created will be saved into the QVD folder, regardless of what deployment folder they've been allocated to. But I'm going to leave it as is. What we have as well when you're working with a WCF component is we have the save changes, which I can now save, and the changes are now saved into my file or database. If someone is also in the admin console and making changes, you can get the current changes that have been made. If you're an advanced Windows user, you can use the class debugger to troubleshoot any issues you might come across while using QVScriptor. After all that's done, I'm going to go ahead and hit exit, and we can start our development.